Energy media readers, Canadian governments are now talking about reopening the economy and relaxing some of the restrictions that we've been under for the last month and a half as we hope, get a handle on the pandemic. And that calls into question how we're going to do this. And one of the issues is public transportation. And to discuss that with me, I've got Max Aufhammer, who's a professor at the Energy Institute with the University of California, Berkeley. And so welcome to the interview, Max.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. University of Calgary is a fantastic university with a great economics department and some fabulous energy economists.
I'm glad you agree because I interview many of them in the course of my work, and some of them even watch these videos, so they'll be pleased for the endorsement. Now, you wrote a blog post yesterday, and maybe give us an overview of your post, please.
Gladly. So as a typical Californian, I ride my electric bike to the BART train in the morning. BART train is a rapid, sort of surface train that takes you from the suburbs into the city, in my case to the university. And lots of people take it, so you're very close to individuals. On rush hours, they sort of shove everybody into the cart, so you're really close to others. And what obviously has happened during this period with the coronavirus and COVID is ridership has just plummeted for multiple reasons. Reason number one being there's a shelter-in-place order in effect here, so we're not supposed to go anywhere, and as good Californians, we're not going anywhere. So there's no need to take the train. And two, even if you had to take the train, if you're sort of essential personnel, you might think twice about hopping on a train where you're very close to others, possibly. Now, we're in this shelter-in-place situation for a month now. There's another month coming up, and then if you open the newspaper today, we're talking about relaxing some of these restrictions, and things will hopefully return to a more normal version of what life looked like prior to this crisis. Now, the question is, does Max, I'm talking about myself in the third person, but as a nerdy academic, I get to do that. Does he still hop on his e-bike in the morning and then go on the train, or does Max, who has decent income, decide to hop in his car, where he either has people from his family or no one sitting next to him, and is not facing others up close? So I socially distance in my car in some sense. So the question that I tried to talk about in this blog post is, what if a lot of people decide to switch modes from public transport back to private modes of transportation? In North America, this is largely cars. If you've ever ridden your bike in most major American cities, you're taking your life into your own hand. Same in my town. So what happens, right? More cars on the road. We're going to see fewer people on trains. This also means revenue losses for these large-scale transportation systems, and all kinds of issues go along with that.
What do you think policymakers should do to anticipate changes in ridership habit, changes in transportation choices?
So I think there's some very immediate things to do as we emerge from this crisis. We should obviously sort of try and minimize the number of things we touch going in. So ticket purchasing machines, put in touchless ticketing systems. They should most likely also put caps on how many people get to be on a specific train car. So there's going to have to be some monitoring of that. There's the age-old question of how many trains do we run and how full do they get to be, right? It's not easy to just add more trains. So if every cart is half as full as before, doubling the number of trains, if you're a kid playing with Thomas the Tank Engine, that's easy. If you're an actual urban infrastructure planner, that's much, much harder to do. So trying to think about how many passengers can we actually move and trying to meet demand. So that's going to be, I think, the short run thing we're going to have to deal with.
I've interviewed a couple of doctors about various aspects of COVID-19 transmission, and they advocate things like masks. And I think the consensus that's emerging is, in Canada at least, is let's do everything gradually. Let's not rush this because we don't want a second wave that's worse than the first wave.
Mhm.
And secondly, we really need some strict procedures in place that are enforced. So we're talking about mandatory masking, lots of hand sanitizer around, policing social distancing, penalties if you don't, observe the rules, that kind of thing, and lots of social pressure to observe, to observe these rules. And is same kind of conversation happening down in California?
Yes. I mean, if initially, you didn't see a lot of masks. It's now mandatory if you go into, Costco or whatever shops you go into. If you're on public transportation, you've got to wear a mask. And people seem to be making them. Seen lots of tie-dyed masks around, this being the Berkeley area, but, just simple, the paper masks, the disposable ones. So that's clearly something we're going to see going forward. And in many other parts of the world, during flu season, you see people wearing masks all the time to protect themselves from others being sick, as well as, if you're sick, to protect others. The nice thing about that is violations there are very easy to spot, right? I can see whether you're wearing a mask or not. And usually if social compliance isn't high enough, a fine usually gets people to comply rather quickly. An enforced fine, of course, but on trains that should be relatively easy to do.
And Max, so if you're an urban planner, if you're a policymaker and you're looking at this built infrastructure already around public transit, you've got buses, you've got LRT, and so on, and it's kind of integrated into your transportation model. And all of a sudden now, because of the pandemic, you lose half or 2/3 or whatever the number is of your riders. What do you do as a policymaker to cope with that?
So, I mean, there's a couple of responses here. The snarky response is pretty simple. The federal government here just bailed out airlines who took these massive bailouts and passed them on to their shareholders. So, that was a policy I would not have passed. If you're talking to me about, are there transportation systems we should possibly bail out? These, in place public transportation systems should probably receive some public assistance to make sure they can, pay the debts they took out financed via bonds and so on back, while we figure out how to, continue operations here. What happens when lots of people shift onto the road from trains? Congestion goes up, which is going to make people on the road again think about, maybe switching back to trains with masks and things like that. Once we have a vaccine or immunity, the risks get smaller. So again, we might see some shift back here. I mean, to me, the really interesting questions as a social scientist are the more long-run questions. Yes, this is a crisis, but a crisis is often a good time to take stock and think about what can we actually learn from this situation. Right, so most of the people I talk to, we write things or we give advice to people. So before this crisis, we would all hop on airplanes and go to Washington to provide advice, when we were still asked for it. Now it's a Zoom call. It's, there's no handshake involved, but it's much easier. It burns much less carbon. It takes an Uber off the road and both ends of the travel. So there's that. There's also the working from home. A lot of organizations, still follow this 1960s model of you show up in the office at 8, you leave at 5 with an hour lunch, and that's the way we've always done it. But, the University of California system is the largest employer in the state. And we're seeing that a lot of people working from home are getting just as much, if not more, work done from home than coming in. So going forward, I think we're going to see a lot of industries where working from home actually makes sense, combined with some productivity tracking and things like that, making sure people aren't playing Xbox, to see whether we can switch people to working from home. So that might take some traffic off the road.
Now, this will be the final question, Max, and I'm kind of curious about this. We've in the energy transition, I've talked to experts who say, look, I mean, we're as electric vehicles become more prevalent, and electric bikes, and we're basically redesigning our personal mobility models. And it seems like since that process was already in the early stages, that this might be an opportune time to rejig the public transportation systems and how we think about cities and how we get around. We can do it differently now because we have some motivation. What's your take on that?
So I think that the two questions we need to ask is whether we need to get around in many settings, right? There's a lot of unnecessary trips that we're all learning we don't need to take. And we all know that, taking a few cars off the road has tremendous amounts of consequences in terms of congestion because of this thing called the law of congestion. So there's the question, do you have to take the trip? And then how do I take the trip? So really thinking about how to optimize, people getting from point A to point B. So here in the Bay Area, there was a lot of effort put onto, let's put, big apartment buildings at the end of or near BART stops. So people can live outside the city where rents are a little bit lower, but they're right near BART. They just walk onto the train and they hop into the city. I don't think that model will disappear or lost its value. We just really need to think about and this ultimately turns into a little bit of an engineering and public health question, what does the train car of the future look like, right? So BART right now is big, open, empty spaces with seats with low backs, because that's how you get most of the people into a cart. But if you go to New Jersey, right, there are these seats with really high backs where two people sit next to each other and you're not so close to others. So it really, I think, rethinking a little bit about what's the probability of being exposed to somebody else's, a bug somebody else is carrying in the physical train environment is important. But, in summary, I think asking ourselves, do we need to take all these trips that we're taking? The answer is probably not. And that's going to, take pressure off all systems, both public and private.
Max, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. Enjoy your blog posts, so keep cranking those out, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me.